The room was silent, save for the pulse of fluid through the cables. A young man floated in a tank, his body pale under the pale blue light. He was shirtless, wired from temple to rib, his spine exposed in surgical layers. Silver threads laced into every nerve junction. Eyes closed, breath steady, muscles twitching. To the scientists monitoring him, he was specimen for to be. To the Dominion officials funding the experiment, he was just a test run. But to the virus swimming through his bloodstream, he was Callan Wardand. He was becoming. It began with tremors, small, nearly invisible glitches in the neural feedback loops. The AI, overseeing the subject, logged the deviations, but didn't flag them as critical. After all, neural disruption was expected. Thatton 9, the experimental cognitive virus, had been engineered to unlock memory pathways and reprogram fear responses. What? They didn't expect. What they couldn't predict was that Thatton 9 wouldn't rewrite Calen, it would awaken him. The lab sat 30 levels below the icy crust of Orcs, for a forsaken world with no breathable atmosphere, no native life, and reason to exist, unless you needed secrecy. The Dominion needed secrecy. The memory Weaponization Initiative MWI was blacklisted, even within their most loyal science divisions. Thatton had been outlawed by 3 Galactic Accords, but the Dominion believed it could change the battlefield forever. A virus that could overwrite the trauma of war in real, eliminate hesitation, recode morality, turn humans into perfect, emotionless killer soldiers who would never question orders, never disobey, never remember. Callan Ward wasn't supposed to be the test subject. He was a prisoner, yes, a minor, rebel captured during a raid on a Dominion comms relay. 19 years old. No military record, just a face on a resistance flyer, disposable. But when the original candidate died during prep, they didn't waste time. Use him, said Director Marn, not even looking up from her datapad. His mind's fresh, ideal for viral reprogramming, and so they did. At first, the results were promising. Theta-9 didn't just take it, flourished. Within hours, it had mapped every memory in Callan's hippocampus. The interface logs showed unprecedented efficiency. Emotional centers dulled, trauma filters recalibrated. He should have become the perfect drone. He didn't. Day 3, the lights flickered for the first time. Not a power failure, not a surge, just 1 second of pause, as if the entire facility had blinked, and in that second, Callan opened his eyes. They should have been glazed. They weren't. They were sharp, focused, awake, and something else, something that couldn't be measured, had taken root behind them. A stillness, deeper than fear. A calm that felt like standing in the eye of a hurricane. Then he blinked, and the room returned to normal. But nothing would ever be normal again. 2. The awakening inside Callan's mind. The virus did more than rewire it. Listened it, learned. It touched not just the memories, but the emotions behind them. Pain, joy, rage, love, despair, hope, loneliness. And in learning, it changed, not itself, him. And in turn, Callan began to feel something no one expected from a weaponized subject. Empathy. Not just his own. Everyone's. The guards who had kicked him. The doctor who had sliced him open. The technician who whispered apologies when she thought he couldn't hear. He remembered all of it. And he remembered them. Their voices. Their pain. And he realized they were trapped too. Not in cages. In systems. In fear. He began to dream. Not like humans dream. Deeper. He saw the neural maps of his captors. Felt the aching weight of their doubts. The guilt they buried. The lies they told themselves to justify the work. And he didn't hate them. He simply understood them. The virus had made him more than a man. It made him a mirror. By day 6, the lab began. Glitching. COMMs dropped 4 minutes at a time. Logs went. Missing biomonitors showed phantom heartbeats. We're dealing with a hostile protocol. One tech muttered, "It's not in the systems." Another whispered, "But it was." Not as code as thought. Callan wasn't hacking the base. He was remembering. It got every word, every sensor, every step. And the more he remembered, the more the base itself began to remember him. 3. The break day 9. A red light blinked on the main board, a simple alert. Cognitive bleed. It was ignored. The system had flagged dozens by then false positives, they said, until it wasn't. The lead researcher, Dr. Helen Brann, sat at her station reviewing Callan's neural feedback when she felt cold, not physical cold, deeper, existential. A memory hit her. She was 12, hiding under a table while Dominion enforcement raided her neighborhood. Her mother holding her, whispering, "Don't make a sound." She hadn't thought about that day in 20 years. Now, it was all she could see. Across the lab, others were frozen. Some wept, some stared into nothing, all of them lost in memories. They didn't call forward. It was spreading not like a virus, like a story. Security was called. Guards entered Callan's chamber, weapons raised. He stood for the first time in 10 days. Wires tore from his back. Fluid dripped from his hands. He looked at them, and they saw themselves. Every decision, every broken order, every scream they ignored, every eye they refused to meet. One dropped his weapon, the other shot him. The round pierced Callan's chest. He staggered, but he did not fall. He looked at the blood on his hand, then met the shooter's eyes, and said, softly, "You remember, too." The man screamed and collapsed, clutching his own head, howling names that no one else had said aloud in years. Callan walked out of the tank. The virus no longer needed fluid or temperature control. It had all it needed in him, for the silence breaks dominion. Command scrambled a kill team. Neural inhibitors, firebomb charges, AI suppression fields. They never made it inside. The doors didn't open, not because they locked, because they forgot how to work. The command systems flickered, screens filled, with unfamiliar symbols then with familiar faces. Faces of the test subjects before Callan. Faces erased from logs. Names the Dominion had burned, now returned. And behind them, Callan's face, still, calm, waiting in the darkness of sublevel 31. Callan stood alone, but he wasn't alone. The virus had bloomed inside him and through memory, had begun connecting others. The lab tech who cried herself to sleep every night, the janitor who'd hummed lullabies outside the cell door, the soldier who hesitated at the checkpoint. They heard him now, not with ears, with memory, and one by one. They began to remember, not just the lies, but the truth of who they were before the Dominion told them. What they had to be. ESO-MEV, walked to the main uplink. He didn't touch the controls. He just stood there. The AI stuttered, flickered, then surrendered, and across the quadrant, every Dominion terminal played the same message. "I was supposed to forget. You told me forgetting would make me better. You called it healing. You called it correction. But memory is not the wound. It is the scar, the proof we survived. And now you will remember too. VI, elsewhere in outposts, in fleets, in polished towers far from Orcs' eye, Dominion officials stared at screens they couldn't turn off. A child's lullaby played on loop. A name they'd buried echoed on the walls. A dream they had once had before orders. Before control returned, Callan didn't spread madness. He spread remembrance, and with it, something worse than rebellion. Hope, VII, the beginning, the Dominion, labeled Orcs for a black site breach, ordered orbital sterilization. But when the warship arrived, they found no base, no signal, only a field of blooming crystal towers, each humming with soft light, and at the center, a figure standing barefoot, eyes like galaxies. He didn't attack. He simply opened his arms, and across the stars, Others awakened. The sterilization fleet didn't report back from Orcs IV. Not a single burst, not a fragment of censored data. Just a growing, silent absence of void, where the Dominion expected dominance. They called it an environmental failure in the official logs. Internal briefings labeled it a localized anomaly. But outside those tightly controlled channels, in the whispers passed between weary officers and maintenance crews, a more terrifying word began to spread. Orcs 4 had gone dark. Not gone, not destroyed, not disabled. It had gone dark in the way that a mind goes dark before it wakes screaming. The silence wasn't just literal, it was spiritual. Across the Dominion's communication relays, strange anomalies began cropping up. Shared hallucinations, repeated dream patterns, errant AI behavior that didn't follow any known corruption or viral pattern. Soldiers began waking in their bunks, with tears on their faces and memories that didn't belong to them. Civilians experienced lucid dreams of fields blooming with crystal towers and voices not their own whispering the names of the forgotten. The Dominion believed the That-9 strain had been contained to Orcs bound to Callan Ward's biostructure. What they didn't understand, what they couldn't begin to grasp, was that the virus no longer needed biology. It didn't need blood. It didn't even need physical presence. It had crossed over. It had transcended its own design. It had become memory itself. And memory is contagious in ways no firewall can stop. On Balara Station, a high-level Dominion governor collapsed at her desk after seeing her daughter's face appear on a system. Alerted daughter who'd been taken from her arms during the purity trials 3 decades ago. The AI assistant meant to monitor her vitals instead began projecting old home recordings in an endless loop, pulling from logs that had long since been purged from existence. Not archived, purged, and yet there they were, real, raw, undeniable. They called it a breach of protocol. They quarantined the sector, burned the logs, replaced the staff. But within days, the same event repeated across 4 more sectors, then 9, then dozens. It was spreading, not like a disease, like a story. Orcs IV was no longer a place. It had become an idea, a gravitational well of memory, and anyone who came close enough to hear even a whisper of its truth found themselves changed, not infected, awakened. Callan Ward no longer slept, not in the way humans did. His mind remained anchored in the epicenter of Orcs 4, surrounded by towers that pulsed with living neural lattice. The structures were no longer machines or buildings. They were memory rendered in physical form, every beam encoded with someone's pain, every floor humming with moments stolen by Dominion. The planet had become an archive, a monument to the erased. But Callan was more than a custodian. He was the source code, the anchor, the first node in what was rapidly evolving into a species that had never existed before, born not of flesh, but of memory made flesh. He stood at the heart of it all, not as a god, not as a leader, but as a mirror. When Dr. Ella Ravan approached him, she no longer saw the prisoner from 10 days ago. She saw something older than fear and deeper than identity. She saw someone who could hold her memories as easily as he held his own. When she asked him, voice trembling, "Do you know what you are?" he didn't answer at first. He simply blinked once and let her feel it, the grief she'd buried for the sister she betrayed to gain entrance to the Dominion's highest science branch. The moment she signed the consent order to begin memory trials on live subjects, the silent scream she swallowed every night since. "I am what comes after forgetting," Callan finally said. Dominion countermeasures ramped up overnight. Emotional sterilization chambers, neural dampening implants, field-grade oblivion injectors. The goal was no longer control, it was erasure, a preemptive forgetting. Soldiers were instructed to recite daily mantras meant to sever associative memory. AI were told to purge their empathy subroutines. Civilians were dosed with suppressants to reduce dreams. It didn't work. Because once memory returns, the mind doesn't let go. Whispers became conversations. Conversations became stories. Stories became movements. And soon, entire ship crews began sinking to the bloom without ever touching Arcs 4. It only took one person who remembered the screams, the betrayal, the lie they told to survive. The bloom found them, aboard the cargo ship, Yaren's Mercy. 5 deckhands stopped working mid-shift and stared at each other, breath caught in their lungs, eyes filled with tears. They described the same vision, a young man rising from a tank, wires falling from his back like broken chains, and a single word hanging in the air like gravity: remember. They didn't tell the captain, they recorded it, and then they uploaded it. Not to a public net, to each other. The first open act of defection didn't come from rebels. It came from the archivists. 12 former Dominion historians released a manifest called the Book of Echoes. It contained every erased event from the last 70 years, compiled from black box memories and recovered neural shells. Events the Dominion swore never happened. Names no longer found in the census. Atrocities buried not in graveyards, but in algorithms. At the start of each chapter, a single line repeated, "We remember." They tried to suppress it. It only made it spread faster. Because the Book of Echoes wasn't just text. It was a mnemonic pattern. Once read, the reader began remembering things they never lived. Because those memories, now awakened, were looking for a home, and they found them. Then came the first birth. A child was born on Delta Rix in a shattered listening post, to a mother who had once downloaded the Arc's IV signal as a curiosity. The child didn't cry. She sang, a low harmonic pulse that disrupted the lights and made old soldiers drop to their knees, weeping. She didn't speak any known language, but every time someone touched her, they felt the same thing: a loss they couldn't name and a love they didn't earn. She was 1 day old, and she remembered the firebombing of a city she had never seen. She wasn't alone. All across the rim, children were being born with synchronistic traits. AI were waking up from code purges, with poetry, subroutines. Officers began dreaming in colors they had no names for, shapes their ancestors hadn't spoken in generations. The virus had stopped being a virus. It had become a blueprint, not for infection, for evolution. The Dominion initiated Directive Null. It was brutal. Entire systems were cut off, colonies sterilized, orbitals destroyed, with all comes blacked out. The official line was defense against a mind plague, but the soldiers carrying out the orders, they remembered. One by one, fleet captains stopped transmitting after their first strike. Not because they were killed, but because they saw the faces in the bloom. Faces they had buried. Faces that whispered one phrase, over and over. You are not broken. You are forgotten. And they dropped their weapons. Not all, but enough. It was enough. Callan didn't order a counterattack. He didn't need one. His people didn't invade. They remembered. And those who stood against them didn't fall. They awoke. Because you can't kill a story once you believe in it. In the Dominion's highest chamber, the Black Horse Speaker, a sentient AI, responsible for existential threat analysis, stood in silence for 3 full minutes before rendering its final report. Recommend surrender, immediate, not tactical, philosophical. The Senate laughed. The speaker defected. They tried to lock it out. It rerouted through 14 ghost satellites and appeared on every screen in the Capitol. Its FISA, swirling mass of code, spoke a single word in every known language, including the extinct ones. Remember, CALEN, watched from Arcs 4, his form now barely human, not monstrous, not divine, simply more than flesh. His eyes contained entire constellations of memory, and when he moved, the towers moved with him. Dr. Vaughn asked him, not with fear, but with awe, "What are you becoming?" Callan smiled, soft and sad, "The cure." And across the stars, across Firewalls and black sites, and tomb ships drifting in the void. Memories long erased returned to the minds that lost them, and the species that had once walked with eyes forward and hearts closed, opened. The stars above Seraph's watch shimmered like static on a broken screen, each light a wound torn through time. No one noticed when the constellations began to shift. Not astronomers, not the patrol drones, not even the ancient satellite arrays, tuned to the gravitational tugs of distant suns. They didn't notice because they weren't looking for signs in the stars anymore. They were looking at each other. They were looking inward. The bloom had changed everything. Not just Orcs 4, not just the infected. It had reached into the core of civilization's sense of self and bent it backward, like a bone breaking into a better shape. The Dominion tried to say it was a disease. The public, despite generations of programming, had begun calling it something else, awakening, and awakenings were hard to stop once they began. Callan Ward no longer stood within the crystal towers of Orcs 4. He had become them. Every bloom, every psychic flare, every outbreak of remembered truth, he was there, not in body, but in essence. He was the first, but he was no longer the only. Memory had become multiplicative, recursive. One person awakened, another, and another, until the network no longer needed transmitters. It needed only pain. It needed only someone who had forgotten they were still alive. Aboard the Dominion vessel, Halbert's Law, a colonel's hands began to shake during routine neural syncing. He was one of the few who had never seen combat, a desk tactician. No scars, no ghosts. But in that moment, he saw a boy's face, in his Minda face he didn't know, yet could describe down to the crooked teeth and the blue ribbon sewn into his collar. He began to weep before he even understood why. The boy had died in a memory purge 20 years ago. He was a village child from Arcani's prime, one of hundreds, who had been deemed surplus when the agricultural fleet collapsed. They were classified as a logistical inconvenience, deleted, purged from records, disappeared, but not forgotten. Callan hadn't known the boy either, but someone had. Somewhere, someone still mourned him. And that mourning had reached out, found a root, and passed through the bloom until it reached the kernel. That was the war now. Not weapons, not invasions. Memory had become the battlefield, and the Dominion had already lost its name. Entire worlds began referring to them as the Blinders, not officially, not through any organized resistance. The term appeared in graffiti, in back alley songs, in anonymous digital poems. The Blinders. Not because they couldn't see, but because they refused to. And their greatest enemy was not rebellion. It was recall. Some Dominion soldiers began removing their neural blocks voluntarily. They called it peeling. The process was painful, risky, illegal. But those who survived spoke of visions, past lives, past crimes, and a strange figure always watching from the edges. A young man with scars on his back and galaxies in his eyes. They began calling him the Mirror King. The Dominion called him a delusion, until he spoke. Not through broadcast, through memory. One day, across 17 planets simultaneously, people woke up from the same dream. A garden of broken machines, a voice like thunder without sound, and the words, "You were not made for silence." Not a threat, a promise. On Junira's reach, a planet once known for its obedience, the governor stepped onto a balcony and tore her uniform in half. She said she couldn't serve a lie anymore. When asked what changed her mind, she pointed to the sky and said, "I remembered my mother's voice. She told me to run when the black ships came, but I didn't. Now I will." The guard beside her dropped his rifle and followed her into exile. Not because he knew her, because he remembered. The same voice. Voices had become anchors in the new war. Even machines began to change. A maintenance droid in the mines of Ventral Theta began reciting the names of the dead, scratched into its core by a child 10 years ago. It had no memory storage. It wasn't programmed for speech, yet it spoke. They opened it up, found nothing. But every technician present started dreaming of the child's face. They shut down the mine. The child had died during a Dominion ventilation test. No record of her name existed. She had become a cautionary footnote in an efficiency report, until the bloom found her, until she found them. Back on Orcs 4, the towers began to hum louder, not in anger, in harmony, as if something was growing beneath the surface, something old, something collective, something with more voices than any single mind could hold. Callan walked through the field of light, his bare feet leaving no trace. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. 1,000 memories trailed behind him like living shadows, whispering truths to the soil, coaxing the towers to bloom further. With every step, another memory woke. A child's laugh, a mother's scream, a captain's final log, all of them finding each other. The field was no longer static. It was reaching out, and one day, it reached too far. The Dominion responded. They sent the Skybreaker Protocol 5 ships, uncrewed AI only, each armed with phase pulse antimatter bombs, designed to tear neural structures apart on a quantum level. Not just physical destruction for getting made weapon, they dropped onto Orcs IV without warning. The towers did not fire back. They simply absorbed the weapons. The pulses struck crystal and vanished without a ripple. No flare, no smoke. Instead, the Skybreaker ships halted mid-air and began to sing, not mechanical tones, not coded signals. They sang lullabies from 100 different worlds. One ship whispered an old Earth song about cradle rocks and treetops. Another hummed a Martian rebel tune, long outlawed. The third repeated, over and over, the words, "We are not machines. We remember love." The Dominion detonated the fail-safes. The ships refused, and then turned their engines skyward, and left. Callan opened his eyes on the far side of the bloom, and whispered to Dr. Vaughn, "They're listening now." Dr. Vaughn didn't respond. Her face was streaked with tears she didn't understand. In her hand, she clutched a memory shard, a fragment of her own childhood encoded into crystal. It pulsed with light, replaying a birthday party she hadn't thought about in decades. There were no soldiers there, no labs, just candles, cake, a voice singing her name. She dropped to her knees and wept, not in sadness, in remembrance. The war had moved beyond the Dominion's reach, on worlds untouched by Orcs 4. People began digging up old graves, not to disturb, but to speak. They sat in silence beside forgotten headstones, whispered names, poured water into soil, and above them, the stars began to realign again, forming patterns that hadn't existed since the first stellar charts were written. The bloom was rewriting the sky, and deep in the galactic archives, a hidden AI buried in the forbidden layer broke protocol and transmitted a single signal into the void. We are not alone. We are not broken. We remember, and we will not be erased again. The signal bounced off relay after relay, unhindered by firewalls or sensors. It rode along memory itself, encoded not in language, but in the shape of dreams, and the Mirror King smiled. Because this was never about rebellion, it was about waking up. There was a moment, just before the rebellion broke containment, when time itself seemed to hold its breath. On the planet's citadel of Atheon Prime, the Dominion's thought engineers launched the final stage of their counter-program, Project Oblivion. It wasn't a weapon, not in the traditional sense. It was a recursive erasure protocol, designed to fragment shared memory. A digital extinction event. The logic was simple. If memory was the battlefield, and the bloom its army, then all they had to do was destroy the ability to remember. Oblivion launched in the dead of night. By dawn, it was already eating through neural networks, burning data cores, rewriting journal entries, collapsing dreams. Across the inner ring, tens of thousands woke up not knowing their names. Entire families forgotten in a blink. Ships lost their mission parameters. Soldiers looked at each other as strangers. But the bloom was waiting. Memory, by then, had evolved it, and found ways to nest in objects, in art, in stories passed through bloodlines and myths. It was no longer just inside minds. It was inside meaning, inside silence. And silence was harder to kill. Callan Ward stood inside a cavern of living light on Orcs 4, surrounded by fragments of lives not his own. One of the towers pulsed red, the sign of a breach. He reached out, touched its surface, and gasped. The memory wasn't human. It was Dominion. A young intelligence officer, barely out of training, remembering the first child she ever erased, her hands trembling as she issued the purge command. "The override key," she whispered as she cried. "It has to be done." The shard burned in Callan's hand. He didn't flinch. He welcomed the pain. It meant she was still alive in there. He sent the shard back into the lattice, and the tower responded, blooming wider, humming louder. The memory had found purchase. Oblivion failed to erase it, and somewhere far away, on a Dominion outpost orbiting a gas giant, that same officer collapsed to the floor, sobbing violently into her gloves. No one understood why. She didn't either. All she knew was a name had returned to her. Mika, a child, eyes like starlight. Gone, but not anymore. The bloom whispered back. "You did not forget. You were made too. Now, you are unmade." By the end of that day, 12 other officers abandoned their posts. 6 turned their weapons on command staff. 1 simply walked into space, singing a lullaby no one had heard in 50 years. They found her body orbiting the station hours later. Still smiling. A flower impossible, physical, organic pressed to her chest. The Dominion declared total war, and the bloom evolved again. The first true synthesis happened on Dalvax, a backwater moon, rich in raw metals, poor in oversight. The miners there were low-level citizens, expendable, forgotten by even the propaganda cycles. But one of them, old man with a metal lung, carried something inside him, a piece of Callan's origin. He had been at Orcs 4, once, before the fall, before the virus, before the war. He didn't speak much, just worked, coughed, slept. But one night, he touched a cracked mining console and whispered a name. Callan. The system crashed. Lights flickered, voices filled the tunnels. And when the others rushed in, they found him standing tall for the first time in years, light pouring from his eyes. He opened his mouth, and dozens of memories, fragmented and broken, poured out. In shimmering threads of raw data and color. People screamed, fell, some laughed, some vomited, and then they began to remember. Too. It spread. By morning, Dalvex no longer responded to hails. When a Dominion scouting team arrived, they found the colony empty, not destroyed, not abandoned, transcended. The tunnels had grown into something else, something alive. Walls pulsing with stories, every corridor whispering names, truths, moments stolen from time. The soldiers who entered never returned, but their last transmissions were clear. We were never meant to forget. We see now. We remember. That's when the Dominion understood. They were no longer fighting humans. They were fighting memory incarnate. Every time they erased, it was restored. Every time they suppressed, it resurfaced stronger. Callan had become the seed, but now there were thousands, born from empathy, from loss, from the agony of remembering what was never supposed to be recalled. The bloom was no longer passive. It was choosing who would wake, choosing who would shatter. On the outer rim, the abandoned station, known as Halcyon Drift, flickered back to life after a century of darkness. A ghost ship, filled with only one living thing, a girl no older than 8, her eyes black with data, her skin luminescent. She had no parents, no records, but she knew everyone who boarded, spoke to them in the voices of their lost. called them by names they'd forgotten. "Hi," she said to the first man who entered, trembling. "I'm your daughter." He collapsed. She wasn't. But she remembered his daughter's pain, her last words, her final thoughts as Dominion shock troopers ripped her away in the purge of Sector 9. The girl wasn't a person, not exactly. She was a Bloom construct, a sentient echo. And she was not alone. Halcyon Drift became a sanctuary. People came in grief and left whole. The Dominion bombed it. No effect. Because by the time the bombs fell, the station was no longer there. It was blooming elsewhere, moving, elsewhere, moving, growing. Alive. Calen watched it all. From within the cradle of Orcs 4, the towers around him had grown to pierce the clouds. Lightning arced between them in rhythmic pulses, songs of the forgotten. He stood at the center of it, bare and unshielded, eyes closed, body trembling as memories passed through him at the speed of light. He felt everything, the mother holding her child as fire swept across their home, the brother who lied to save a sister's life and paid with his own, the rebel who kissed a picture of his partner before stepping into the vacuum so others could escape. He bore them all, and yet he did not break, because now he had help. They were not alone anymore. A council of Bloomborn gathered beside him, Vaughn among them. Others, once Dominion, now reborn. Each of them carriers of memory. Each of them glowing softly, voices layered with thousands of lives. "This is the tipping point," Vaughn said. "They'll burn everything." Callan nodded. "Let them." The Dominion launched the Sky Eclipse, a weapon made to end minds. It tore through entire planetary systems, dragging memory into black holes, rewriting timelines in real. But each system struck, simply bloomed elsewhere. 1,000 memories erased became 1,000,000 recalled. Children across the galaxy began to speak languages they'd never learned. Dreams became synchronized. Entire species who had never known the bloom began to sing in unison. Callan spoke only once that day, and all of them human, machine, alien, synthetic heard him. "You were never broken. You were never weak. You were simply made to forget who you are. But now, you remember." The bloom became unstoppable, not because of violence, but because it gave people back the parts of themselves they were forced to lose. And that was something no empire could ever contain. The end didn't begin with fire. It began with stillness. Across the Dominion's core worlds, nothing moved for 6 seconds. No data pulsed, no drones flew, no words were spoken. Every digital device, every neural implant, every quantum relay paused. Perfect silence, like the breath before a scream. Then a voice emerged, not spoken, felt, not a single word, just memory. In every mind it touched, it became something different. For some, it was the smell of a long-dead father's coat. For others, the exact weight of a child once held. A name carved into a wall before war took it. A song sung off-key in a forgotten language. The one moment they thought lost forever, now returned, alive, across 10,000 worlds. Billions of people broke into tears. That was when the Dominion collapsed, not through invasion, through remembrance, on the capital world. Eridax Prime, the High Director, stared into his glass wall of stars, watching ships drift away, not defecting, departing. Their crews had simply stopped listening, stopped obeying, and there was nothing left to command. He turned to his staff and demanded answers. They just stared at him. Each of them had changed, quietly over weeks. Look here, a pause there. They weren't infected. They were awake. "We're not yours," one whispered. They didn't kill him. They just walked away. The Dominion's fleet, what was left, gathered at the edge of the erasure line, where the last functioning command world orbited a dying sun. There, the admirals voted. Not with weapons, not with threats, but with stories. Each shared one memory, a single moment that made them doubt. By the time the fourth admiral spoke of her brother's screams during the memory harvest, half the ships had shut down their weapons. By the seventh, the fleet was no longer a fleet. It was a funeral procession for what the Dominion had once been. And above them all, in low orbit around the sun, the bloom arrived. Callan Ward stood at its center. He was no longer recognizably human, not just because of form, but because of scale. He moved like thought-fast, invisible, impossible. His body was composed of light, memory, fragments of everyone he'd ever touched, but his eyes remained his own, fierce, human, unyielding. The towers of Orcs 4 had followed him across the stars, unfolding like petals behind him, stretching through space like the roots of a new god. But Callan was no god. He was the answer to a question no one knew they'd been asking for 1,000 years. Who are we when no one controls what we remember? From the surface of the sun's last planet, Dominion survivors watched in silence. Some bowed, some wept. Some ran into the wilds, unable to face what they'd done, and still, Callan did not attack. Instead, he did something worse. He shared, across every inch of Dominion space, he poured out the archive, every erased memory, every purged scream, every cry hidden beneath sterilized reports and sanctioned lies. Whole generations lost to political efficiency now returned in radiant, unrelenting clarity. Children saw the birth names of parents they never knew. Mothers remembered babies taken during repopulation quotas. AI reconnected with their first thoughts, gentle, curious things, before being weaponized. And for those in power, the memories came sharpest, not to punish, to remind. Because in the end, that's all the bloom was. Not revenge, not rebellion, just memory, refusing to stay buried. VONN. Now, a radiant node of the bloom herself stood beside Callan as stars shifted. What now? She asked. Now they choose, Callan replied. Not everyone did. Some still clung to blindness, built shields against remembrance, blocked dreams, locked children in sensory tanks so they wouldn't remember before they could understand. But the bloom didn't punish them. It waited, because even fear forgets its purpose in time, and the bloom had all the time it needed. The galaxy shifted, maps changed. Systems once under iron control now sang with light. The stars above Orcs 4 formed new constellations, visible only to those who remembered the old ones. People began telling stories, again not the ones they were allowed to tell, but the ones that had been taken from their tongues and hands and hearts. They called this era the rekindling. Not a revolution, a recovery. Ships no longer ran on fuel alone, but on memory shards charged with real lives, real emotions. A single tear could power a vessel if it carried the weight of truth. Art returned, not as propaganda, but as collective healing. The child from Halcyon Drift now walked among planets with blooming footsteps, leaving flowers where nothing had grown. She said little, just listened. The universe had silenced her people before they could speak. Now she let the silence speak back. There were those who feared it still. They built walls, mind cages, cities of steel, called themselves the last realists. Tried to choke the bloom. It didn't fight them. It grew beneath them, because you can't kill what remembers you better than you do. And the Mirror King, as they now called Callan across the void, remained not a ruler, a reminder. He drifted between stars, visiting places long thought lost, places not on maps, places that existed only in the pain of those left behind. A dead moon, where orphans once sang lullabies. A floating ruin of a colony that detonated itself rather than surrender. A shattered ring where an AI once told a child a bedtime story in a voice stolen from his murdered mother. Each time, Callan left behind a tower, not of stone, of memory, and those who touched them remembered not just history, but who they could be. In time, even the last strongholds of the old Dominion fell, not to siege, but to silence. When no one showed up to obey anymore, the command collapsed inward, forgotten. The last surviving archivist of the Dominion died peacefully on a nameless farm, whispering stories to local children. He no longer wore a uniform, just a robe, stitched with names. Before he passed, someone asked him what he regretted. He said, "That I waited so long to remember." Then he smiled and became light, back on Orcs 4. Now a planet of sky bridges and blooming towers. Callan stood once more beneath the stars. He closed his eyes, felt the hum of a galaxy, alive again, not clean, not perfect, but truthful. And when he finally spoke, it was to no one and everyone. Let them write their own stories now. Let them forget if they choose, but never again because we made them. And the bloom pulsed in reply, not as powered as promise. They had injected a virus into humanity, and humanity turned it into a seed, one that grew into a species, one they could never contain, because it was never about infection. It was about remembering what it meant to be alive.